right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for braving the rain if you came from outside the building. This is our monthly lecture series that the Interior Museum presents. A little bit different for us. This one is going to be a hands-on activity. So I'm really happy to be welcoming Tracy Baetz, our curator. She curated the POSTERity exhibit that is currently on at the Interior Museum. So if you haven't seen that yet, I encourage you to go pretty much just directly upstairs in one corridor over to the Interior Museum, and you can see the entire exhibition that's on view. Tracy joined our staff about a year ago. She's the curator of the newly opened POSTERity exhibit, as I mentioned. She comes to us with a real wealth of knowledge and prior experience. She holds a master's degree in American Studies from Florida State University with a dual Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Government, both from the College of William and Mary. And she's worked curating shows on very, very diverse topics such as photography, baseball, rustic furniture, and folk art. Her career has spanned nearly 25 years at the local, state, and federal museum level, including a decade at the Smithsonian Institution. And she's worked 7 years as the executive director at the accredited Brickstore Museum in Southern Maine. She's a member of the exhibition team, which brought the unprecedented Smithsonian show to the American Festival in Japan, and served as curator and outreach coordinator for the Smithsonian's 150th anniversary traveling exhibition. She was later the founding program manager for Smithsonian Affiliations, a national initiative still in existence involving robust partnerships and programming with more than 125 museums nationwide. So she is used to really large projects, and we're very, very happy that she's been with our museum staff here for a year. Really enjoyed working with her. So please give a warm welcome to Curator Tracy Baetz.
Hi, thanks so much for coming out today, and again, braving the rain, a little bit of a drizzle. Many of you here today were no doubt lured by the prospect of trying your hand at silk screening, and I promise that you'll get a chance to do that. But really the price of admission here this afternoon is to gain a little historical context for the activity that you're about to do. So it'll take about 20 minutes or so of a presentation. We're really going to blitz through about 9 years of history, kind of at a cruising altitude here. There will be some facts and figures, but no test. The details are kind of just for effect. But what I'm really hoping that you're going to walk away with this afternoon is not just a silk screen print in your tote bag, but a broader perspective and a renewed appreciation for a really singular period in American history. My remarks here today touch upon, as does the exhibition upstairs, a story that's really born out of economic hardship, but yet fueled by creativity. And it tells of reinvention, entrepreneurialism, and ultimately a really amazing artistic legacy. So let's get started here and set the stage. On the heels of the stock market crash of October 1929 comes widespread panic. The dissolution of banks, the Great Depression, plunging by estimations 13 to 15 million Americans into unemployment. That's 15 to 20% of the American population at that time out of work. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes office in March of 1933. At the helm of a dispirited nation, you're probably all familiar with his famous first inaugural address, and my imitations are really poor, but it's the one where he says, you know, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that's really what catapults the nation into the resolve to put itself on the road to economic recovery. And he implements a myriad of initiatives that would collectively become known as the New Deal. There are some 45 distinct programs in all that fell under that umbrella of the New Deal, and it's super confusing because, and I'm giving a talk on it, but it's super confusing because a lot of them were sort of short-lived. Others lasted longer than others. They changed their names midway through, so it's a little confusing, or they morphed into something else as time went on. Well, our vehicle for exploring these programs today is also going to give you a virtual tour through one of our hometown memorials. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you have visited the FDR Memorial? Just about everybody here, which is great. A real quickie background, if you haven't been in a while. The memorial was designed by Lawrence Halprin. It opened in 1997 to the public. If you've never been, the basic construct of it is a series of 4 outdoor rooms which essentially mirror the 4 terms of his presidency. We're going to focus in on room 2. You come into it and you immediately see, and if you've been, you know, 3 bronze sculpture groups. One is of a gentleman sitting by the radio listening to an FDR fireside chat. There's another grouping that's a rural couple kind of braving the hardships of the Depression, and then there's a very iconic bronze sculpture group that is an urban breadline. And it all underlines the kind of the hardship that was happening at the time at a very personal, very tangible level. But then as you round the corner, the space opens up into something very different, very abstract. The artwork is by Robert Graham, and it's entitled Social Programs. And on that wall there that you see right in here are 39 partial scenes that depict the various New Deal endeavors. The arrangement of these 5 columns, and this is a word I just learned, it's called a quincunx, just in case you get that on game show. It's that sequence of the 5 columns. And it has those same 39 images as the wall, but done in the negative, in the reverse. So, and it's supposed to symbolize literally the rolling out of these programs across the country and making a positive impact on the country. Well, on one of the panels, and if you zoom in close here, and it's right down here, it's pretty microscopic actually, are the names of the 45 programs and the dates that they were operational. So you've got PWA, the CCC, WPA, FWP, FMP, FAP, FDP, HRS. I mean, it's enough to kind of make your head spin, and you know, and you can't really see it on the memorial very well. It's kind of a veritable alphabet soup. Let's get down to business of kind of deciphering all of these acronyms and making sense of that alphabet soup using the panels from the FDR Memorial as kind of our guide. So first up, we've got the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And if you know probably only one thing about the New Deal era, that's the one that you're familiar with, is the CCC. It's the one that comes up in the Jeopardy questions, that kind of thing. It's founded in 1933, so one of the first ones. Its parameters get tweaked over time, over its 9-year existence, but its essence was to be intended for unemployed, unmarried young men, ages 18 to 25. Basically, it's Iron Mike here over at the side of the screen. He's actually a representational CCC worker, and that statue appears, among other places, at Shenandoah National Park. If you've ever been up to the Big Meadows Visitor Center area, he's standing there. There are other versions of him around the parks. And Shenandoah alone employed 10,000 CCC workers during that time period. CCC workers got into great physical shape because of the work that they were doing. They gained an appreciation for America's public lands, and they received a paycheck of about $30 a month. Now, because they were living in CCC camps, and their food and their shelter and their clothing was provided for them, their subsistence was pretty low, and so they got to keep $5 a month, and then the 25 remainder was automatically sent home to their families. As to the kind of work that they did, again, let's just look to these panels here. This guy up here on the left is planting a tree, and all in all, CCC workers planted nearly 3 billion trees on reforestation projects. The other scene here is of some men driving in posts for cattle fences. But the CCC workers also upgraded utility lines, they stemmed erosion, they built fire lookouts, you name it, they did it. Unless you think, I mean, this title of this talk was in sort of the art legacy of the WPA, unless you think that that work isn't an artistic legacy, I kind of just challenge you to just look at the national parks because you can see that the indelible mark that they left there. Great example, Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico. They built not only park roads and miles of trails, but they also built 31 exquisite buildings that were ultimately used for park administration in the Pueblo Revival style. It's now an entire historic district. They go out and drill rock, as the sequence appears here left to right, at Sequoia National Park in California. They build fish rearing ponds at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They construct roads and guardrails out on Skyline Drive. If you've ever been out there, you can thank the CCC. And they further beautify Acadia National Park in Maine. So it's truly a coast-to-coast initiative. 3 million men participating over the course of those 9 years. Pretty amazing. Well, then you have the WPA. This was the Works Progress Administration, later renamed in 1939 as the Work Projects Administration, just to keep things a little confusing. But it was perhaps the most ambitious of them all. It was in operation from 35 to 43 and ultimately created 8 million jobs. So you top that onto the 3 million with the CCC. 7% of the WPA budget went towards art projects. Federal Project Number 1, that was what they named it, of the WPA, gave rise to 5 subset programs, collectively known as the Federal One. You see why this gets so confusing. But we're going to take a look at quickly at 4 of them because they show up on the memorial and they show up very much in society. First one here is the FTP, which is not File Transfer Protocol, but the Federal Theater Project. It was founded in August of 1935 to employ jobless theater workers. You take a look at these plaques here and you can kind of see and think. You've got actors. They made up 46% of the Federal Theater Project. You have stagehands making up another 14%, directors just 4%. But then there are also ushers, stagehands, the costume designers, the clerks, and instructors actually for acting as well. The all-time peak on the rolls for the theater project topped out at about just under 13,000 people. I was just reading a report from 3 years into the Federal Theater Project, which actually kind of was nearing the end of its lifespan, saying that an estimated 30 million Americans had attended at least one WPA presentation since the start of the program. I mean, those are staggering numbers. And there's this great quote about how they continue to provide entertainment and education and fun for millions of Americans from coast to coast. So not surprisingly, the largest concentration of the theater project centers were in New York City. Not a surprise. They had initially 5 units. One of them was the Negro Theater. But by 1938, the theater project ended up being in 20 different states at 42 different locations. Not surprisingly, they tended to be big metropolitan centers: Los Angeles, Philly, Chicago, San Francisco. The productions that they did kind of blow your mind. They were really diverse. They ran the gamut from light opera to marionette and puppet shows. Yeah, for real. And there's puppets up there. To musical comedy and to even Yiddish repertory. The theater project used existing theaters, but if there weren't theaters where they wanted to go, they just created ones where there were none. Locales really tended to play up if they had any dramatist connections. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with Booth Tarkington. He's from Indiana, and so a lot of the Indiana playwrights and theater houses ended up producing his plays. The theater project was also a test bed, so to speak, for playwrights like Arthur Miller, who gained their fame later. But it was also really integral to the careers of the likes of Orson Welles, who actually produced at the Negro Theater a version of Macbeth. You see that program there. John Houseman and Burt Lancaster. There's your trivia piece for the day. Yes, that is him. Burt Lancaster's there doing the acrobatics in that photo. He got his start with the theater project in circus acts, and before you ever heard about him on the silver screen. The theater project also ended up really being among the most controversial of the programs because of its emphasis on social themes. They had a program that they did called The Living Newspaper that really kind of tackled socioeconomic themes of the day, and it ended up coming under the House Committee for Un-American Activities under investigation. They finally ended it with an act of Congress in June of 1939. But moving on, we'll go to our Federal Writers Project. This one was in operation from 35 to 39, and then was extended via the states for another several years through 1943. The primary focus here was on comprehensively researching and producing travel guides. They were called the American Guide. This one here is called an almanac. They're all kind of the same idea. They were, in today's terms, they were kind of crowdsourced in the sense that each state had a director. But then they had teams of people going out and canvassing the state to glean historical information and folklore and recipes and traditions, and it was really amazingly comprehensive. In these cases, the compilations were never attributed to a single author, so you won't find an author's name on these guides. In addition to encouraging the writing of manuscripts and plays and gleaning sort of all these collections of oral history interviews, you did have people that were writing books. You saw Neil Hurston's name that a lot of you know. Their Eyes Were Watching God, the Go Gator and the Muddy Water. Her works were published obviously under her name. But what I didn't know as much about, and it's an incredible resource to this day, is that the Writers Project also interviewed and photographed some 2,300 former slaves. You're not that far out, you're less than 100 years out of the Civil War, and they interviewed and did oral histories with all these folks for the Slaves Narrative Project, and published a 17-volume set in 1941 that you can imagine the historical value to this day. Our next one here, the Federal Music Project. It's estimated that 66% of professional musicians were unemployed during this time period. If you think back to what I said a few minutes ago, that the average unemployment rate at the height of the Depression was anywhere between 15 and 20%. So that's 66% of musicians. That's way, way above the regular average. So they were, a sector that was really hurting. At the peak of the Music Project in 1936, they were employing about 10,000 musicians, not only to provide instruction, so music lessons to people, but also to perform. They had ensembles, they had choirs, they had full orchestras, and in addition to doing the live performances, they also did recordings, like the one that you see there. Well, our fourth one here is kind of the mother lode. It's the Federal Art Project, FAP. It was specifically dedicated to art in all forms, as the plaques on the memorial show you here. They're doing lithography and sculpture and drafting, and again some more sculpture here. There was a big push for art education, and somewhere between 10 and 25% of what ended up being 6,000 artists through the FAP provided instruction for all ages, and there was a real emphasis here on children. And then there were really elaborate exhibitions. So once you taught them, you displayed their work, and it wasn't just children's work, it was adults' work as well, all over the country. The artists were also employed to create what was known as the Index of American Design. They literally went out and photographed 20,000 pieces of American fine and decorative art, folk art, handicraft, to kind of document the American experience. Still other FAP artists created literally tens of thousands of sculptures and easel paintings, yet others produced very distinctive graphics, many of which I've pulled for this talk, to publicize zoos and community activities, educational programs, public health initiatives, ultimately across 17 states and the District of Columbia. They produced theater posters for the Theater Project, book jackets and illustrations for the Writers Project. So yeah, there was a little bit of synergy there. But a third of the artists producing these posters ended up coming out of New York City. Again, probably not a surprise, but by 1938, the Federal Art Project artists were in poster divisions spreading to all 48 states, with the Chicago units producing sometimes as many as 1,500 posters a day. So we're going to go back to our FDR Memorial plaques for a second. They're pretty handy. And you'll notice several having to do with production of murals. He's plastering a wall over here and sketching out his design and mixing the paints. And it just so happens that by being in this building today, it's the one that literally epitomizes New Deal murals. And several of you I know have been on mural tours here in the building. When Secretary Ickes began construction on this, our new headquarters building in 1935, as part of that public works project, number 4, you can see it emblazoned on the sign down there. It literally was the first government building to go up in DC during FDR's administration. Approximately 1% of the construction budget was allocated for public art. And just to throw some more confusing acronyms at you, technically the artists that were working here in the building were not the PWAP, the Public Works of Art project people that were early on in the WPA, and they were ones getting a weekly salary, so those weren't them. And nor were they technically FAP artists. Rather, they were secured through this kind of special hybrid New Deal program known as the Section, with the idea being to get the creme de la creme of artwork for the public building. So the Section of Fine Arts awarded commissions to artists. They were competitive. They were paid substantial contracts in money of the day. In the case of the Department of the Interior, Our building has more New Deal artwork than any other federal building, and it's second only to the old post office department, which is now the Ariel Rios building over in Federal Triangle, in terms of the actual number of artists that are represented. So you have pieces for public spaces. For those of you that work in the building, this looks familiar to you. It's Boris Gilbertson with his bison and moose in the main corridor near the C Street lobby. He was contracted to do that for about $6,000. James Achai, Kiowa artist, is shown here working right outside here in the cafeteria on the Harvest Dance Lunette, right outside, for $2,000. And Alan Hauser up in the Indian craft shop. There's murals in there as well. He was contracted to do those for $2,000. And then you have themed murals, which went through really meticulous review processes to be a reflection and to be emblematic of the different missions and activities of all of our bureaus, a la the mid-1930s. So shown here is one of James McCosh's murals. They tend to be done in pairs, so this was the ones for the themes for the national parks. And then Maynard Dixon, so the themes for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Both of those were contracted for $4,400 a piece. So they're making substantially more than folks that were doing other programs with the FAP. So now we're entering our home stretch on the FAP artists. While the rest of the country was putting FAP artists to work on community posters, or on more than 1,100 murals in civic buildings, think post offices, city halls around the country, the Department of the Interior used FAP artists in two very, I think, intriguing ways. The first was with the U.S. Travel Bureau. And that same Secretary Ickes, he just comes up again like a bad penny. He really gets around. He authorized the Travel Bureau's creation in February of 1937. As a portion, it came under the National Park Service at the time, later fell under the Office of the Secretary. The funding and the personnel for it came from the WPA, but also the Park Service, with a mission to promote travel to and within the United States. Even then, they were knowing that, travel is a good economic stimulus. If you have people traveling around the country, they're spending money. So they had their offices in New York, and they produced travelogue films. They did radio programs. They employed the FAP artists to create promotional brochures and posters. They got to sign their works. And even though it wasn't a Bureau prerequisite, a lot of these, for obvious reasons, ended up showcasing public lands. You see Montana there, that we have ones on display in the exhibition that are Carlsbad Caverns and Arches. So they did not coincidentally show Park Service lands. They did approximately 7 of the specifically the See America series before the U.S. entered World War II, and the Bureau's operations ceased, as did many of these WPA programs with the start of the war. The second use of the FAP artist was at the National Park Service's Museum Division. It was located out, it's called the Western Museums Laboratory. The Western one was in Berkeley, California. The Eastern one was up in New Jersey. At any given time, approximately 100 members of the workforce were this kind of revolving door coming through, and provided it from the WPA at no cost to the Park Service. So this was great, essentially free labor for them. Some of those workers in the FAP artists came very highly skilled, while others required training and were detailed to very specific projects, but with NPS supervision. I was just going through the memoirs of one woman who was a professional artist and came in through the FAP, but she literally, in the span of 2 years, she had 5 different assignments with the Western Museum Labs, and for only one of these details did she actually come to the project with the specific art skill that they were needing her to do. So they just figured she could adapt, and of course she was grateful to be getting paid and having a job, but there was a certain degree of catch as catch can, and a little bit of disorganization with that as well. But the point is that artists with very highly specialized skills were indeed put to work, and you see here kind of a full turnkey operation with the laboratories, fabricating just about anything you could possibly want for our burgeoning new National Park Service visitor centers around the country. They produced incredibly intricate models and dioramas, didactic paintings, maps, even traveling displays. And I love this one for a trade show. It's the Glacier National Park Vacation Adventureland. So yeah, they really went to town with this. And in this image here, you see a room full of artists working at drafting tables By 1938, Dor Jaeger, he was the guy who was the kind of the assistant chief for the museum division, and he was really advocating at that point a move from hand-drawn graphics, very time-consuming, to silk screening. See, it all comes back around. A trend in printmaking that was really rapidly gaining traction and national attention. Silk screening allowed a couple things. It allowed for full color, albeit in layers. You had to print each color as an individual layer, let it dry, add the next one. But you still could do multiple colors. You could do mass production at comparatively inexpensive pricing, anywhere from 10 to 12 cents a piece, which was great. Another bonus was that silk screening is, and this is another Jeopardy trivia piece, is the only form of traditional printmaking where you don't have to do the letters in reverse. You're doing them, which is great. And so if you're hand lettering something, you have to kind of think about how you're going to print it. Silk screening, not an issue. The stenciling aspect, because that's essentially what it is of silk screening, really can trace its origins back thousands of years, Roman Empire, China, Egypt, but it hadn't really been extensively used as a fine arts tool in the United States before this. They used it on some textiles, some wallpapers, department store kind of displays, but not really for this kind of application. But by the end of 1938, not only had this Dor Jaeger committed the Park Service to silk screening, but they'd also published a pamphlet. Park Service didn't, but it came out of the FAP. And it's this one here, this technical problems of the artist, the silk screening process, and it's this guy, Anthony Valonis, and here he is. He himself was an FAP artist working out in New York City. He is credited with coming up with the term serigraph, and that's what they call these silk screen prints, was serigraphs, and really kind of launching it and spreading it as a new medium. He felt very strongly about differentiating between his version of silk screening, the fine art applications of silk screening, and its sort of commercial predecessors, the more industrial kinds of things. And he wanted a more befitting, distinctive term to kind of elevate the profession and really the finesse and the creativity that you had to use to produce it. So he literally sat down at the library and started thumbing through a dictionary to come up with a word that would be the right one. And so he came up with serigraph, and it's really a mushed together version of the Latin of sericum for silk, and graphene, which was Greek, I guess, for to draw. Hence you have serigraph. And then he was very savvy about this. He knew that if he kind of launched it himself, it wouldn't gain traction. So he just started casually dropping it in conversation on the New York art gallery scene. He's like, oh, look at these serigraphs over here. Isn't that really cool, the serigraphs here? And so art critics started picking this up, writing about it, and kind of appropriated it for themselves. He didn't get credit for it later, but that's really how it kind of came to be. So much so that by 1940, you have another FAP artist, Harry Gottlieb, who's at the New York World's Fair, and he's giving silk screen demonstrations. So as for the National Park connection to this, many taking advantage of the laboratory's silk screen posters that they started offering. We're also working with the laboratories on other projects, some of these dioramas and the didactic painting. So it was a ready-made audience for them. Ultimately, the Park Service and the FAP artists produced 14 designs for advertising the national parks, creating probably no more than 100 of each design. They began with the somewhat experimental Grand Teton poster that you see here in 1938, and then ended with the bandolier serigraph in 1941. All but 2 of the designs were for Western parks. The only 2 Eastern ones were Fort Marion, which is now Castillo de San Marcos down in St. Augustine, and also the Great Smoky Mountains. I think it's really evident from here that you can see their appeal. They're cool, they're retro. How they can achieve a sense of depth and scale using a very minimal number of colors. That Grand Teton one on the left only uses 4 different colors. Most of them use no more than 6. And they're exceedingly rare. Of the nearly 2 million posters printed overall by all the FAP artists across all the different projects, not just the Park Service, 2 million, only about 2,000 of them are still in existence. They weren't meant to be collector's items. They were broadsides. They were things that were done for public consumption. So 2,000 of them exist. It's like 0.1%. So factor into that, then you have 14 national park designs. They may be printed 100 of each, so there's 1,400 there. We only know of about 40 originals that exist. We have 6 of them upstairs in the exhibition. So it just, again, goes to kind of show that that's pretty special. Unfortunately, we have very little to go on in terms of knowing who the artists were. They didn't sign their works. We think we know at least one. This man here, Chester Don Powell. Where is he? There he is. He was a FAP artist making just over $1,000 a year in 1939, supporting a family of 5, worked about a mile away from the labs, rented his house for about $12 a month. Today you're going to make like Don Powell and experience the physicality and the skill involved in pulling a print using the same materials and the basic techniques that he did with his colleagues. A squeegee, an ink, a set of ink, and the paper, the tote, and the screen. And it's not as easy as it looks. You're about to silk screen a very special commemorative design that was done for us by Brian Mabius. He's the contemporary artist who's been involved in the National Park poster project, from reeditioning some of the original posters to creating new designs and keeping that artistry alive. In the short time that we've had this afternoon, I hope I've been able to convey some of the enormity of the New Deal programs. It's kind of like drinking out of the end of a fire hose because there's just so much of it coming at you. But to kind of really impress upon you the rich tradition that you're about to kind of bring full circle with pulling your print here today. So in the interest of time, and so that you can get to silk screening, I'm happy to field your questions sort of in the field as you're waiting and prepping your pieces. But I'm going to hand the mic over now to Diana to explain how we're actually going to go about turning you into screen printers extraordinaire. So thank you.